the amount of obese supermodels that we saw, right? The overweight supermodels. There was this idea that, like, I want the right to be a supermodel, but I don't want the responsibility of what it means to actually be a supermodel. We all know what a supermodel looks like: Cindy Crawford, Tyra Banks, and all this stuff. And so, this idea that anyone can be a supermodel is a big fat lie and something that men would never fall in line to. That's why you've never seen an overweight male supermodel, because men are not delusional in that way. And I think this comes from the masculine grasp on how a privilege comes with an obligation and a burden. That's just how it works. Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ancient Intelligence. You've got your host, Anya Shack. And today I want to get into a conversation on rights, responsibilities, chivalry, what all that has to do with each other. I've done a lot of research this week, and I've been getting into listening deeply to Janice Fiamengo, which has been really beautiful and enlightening. Spent a lot of hours with her content, ordered her book, and I just feel like I have learned quite a bit around the history of the women's movement in a way that is deeper and more true. And I am sifting through that and want to get into some of the things that I think are really interesting and why certain things are the way they are, specific to the difference between how men and women view rights and what I've noticed. And again, I am still kind of digging into this, and this is going to be a little bit of like a research gathering episode and some storytelling and some ways that I've connected the dots. And so let's just go ahead and get into it. One of the things that has been a big takeaway from getting into the 1800s women's movement and where that started and why that started has been this big aha that I realize a lot of people are not aware of. And specifically, that's how do we define a right? Right. So I think this is that foundational distinction where men really see a right as a privilege that has been afforded due to a burden that they have to carry, right? A big burden, an obligation. And because I'm carrying that burden, I then have the privilege or right to make decisions, to lead, to do X, Y, Z. I think that back in the 1800s, when women were talking about, okay, I want the right to vote, I want the right to vote, there was a real disregard for what the right to vote actually even meant back then. And again, when we talk about women, I am at this point talking about the elite, wealthy white women of the early to mid 1800s that started this movement, right? Because actually, there's a great statistic that back in 1895, the state of Massachusetts asked 575,000 voting age women if they wanted suffrage. 22,000 of them said yes. That's less than 4%. So when we talk about women starting the women's movement, it is a tiny little group of very wealthy women that actually had a lot of disdain for men based on their own trauma and their own attachment issues and their own super narrow upper class elite lens that they were looking at life through. And so it's really important to kind of see it that way. One of the interesting things that I learned over this past week is just the origins of the women's movement in the United States in general, starting really with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wrote the Declaration of Sentiments and it's this really crazy document that was based on a lot of lies. And upon listening to Janice Fiamengo, I kind of got the feeling that, and the idea based on some of that storytelling about her early life, this woman was highly resentful of her own father. Her brother died when he was 10 years old, when she was little, and her father, was devastated about that because, his only son was gone, his male heir was gone. And she really took that to mean that she wasn't good enough for him. She wasn't as good as her brother was to him. And that therein lies the origin of the women's movement. One woman's challenging relationship and trauma with her father, um, who then did not heal that, did not, work on that with herself, and then projected all of that resentment onto an entire group of people, onto an entire sex, effectively, and created so much upheaval within that. And so really important to always remember that. And I feel like I've done an episode before around like, the origin story of everyone's resentment and frustration is always something to do with their opposite sex parent, and or with their same sex parent. It's all about those attachment wounds and in early childhood development. And so when we take that and we realize, okay, that's where a lot of this stuff comes from, you start to see that actually the origins of the women's movement were not so great and were not so empowering and really did not have the best interests of women at heart at all. The narrative, the common understood kind of mainstream narrative, even for people that are criticizing feminism right now, is like, well, the early stages of feminism were really great, but in the 60s and 70s, that's when it all went to shit because, second wave, third wave, that's where the bad stuff happened. But upon doing more research and recognizing what actually went on, it's always been anti-male in sentiment. And first of all, that's just stupid and not very effective. There could have been a much better way to mm, get any other needs met, right, by partnering with men, as opposed to making yourself the opponent of men. And that's what people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of her contemporaries did, and same with some of the suffragettes in over in the UK. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a little girl who was shamed, and then that shame became anger and resentment. And she became this little girl kind of stuck in this grown woman's body as she grew older. And we know that that is, if we think about the people that we know and people that we've met, people that have that anger and resentment, you see that there's no peace in them, there's no joy in them, right? It's because they're those little kids that were hurt, stuck in their adult bodies, right? And we see that in men, we see that in women. That is not a gender specific thing. So, with that, she made a lot of claims that weren't actually really true. And what I find interesting is that I talk about Rob Henderson a lot too. I think he's phenomenal, and his idea about luxury beliefs and him coining the term luxury beliefs. Around the elite upper class, and he's been talking about that in his work. I see luxury beliefs happening right then and there in the early 1800s with her and the way that she talks about things, right? So she talked about how, women didn't have the right to own property, they didn't have the right to higher education or starting a business. And the truth is that none of that is true. She herself went to an elite university, right? That was already open for about 15 to 20 years before she even started writing some of these documents, which that first convention that they held at Seneca Falls was 1848. And that's where she presented her Declaration of Sentiments, which was all of these things that she called out. And that wasn't true. She went to higher education. There were women's universities that were opening before that time. So women actually had a huge amount of influence on what was happening in their society because they were extremely influential and had a lot of moral authority with their husbands, with their brothers, with their fathers, right? Like I always say, like men loved women and men wanted to do what was best for women. And so what's interesting is that the way that she and some of her contemporaries painted the picture was that men had these unalienable rights and they kept all of that away from women. And it was women's duty to like fight and get that. when really that's not how it went down at all. And I actually connected this with just working on projects with people, right? You guys have been in corporate or you're in corporate or you've worked on different projects and assignments and work, right? How does that usually go? Well, there's an assignment comes through. We need to start building something. We need to create something. And then someone sets out a plan. Usually it's the most resourceful person, right? It's like, okay, well, here's what I see. Who has it? Who has builds? And then someone's like, oh, don't forget about this. What about this? What about that? And that's actually how I see the structure of society having gone for all of these hundreds and hundreds of years. Men looked around and they were like, okay, we got to build this. We got to create some shelter. We got to create safety. And they did. And then they're like, okay. And then when women, because women were always quite influential, women were extremely influential all throughout history, allying with strong, impactful men and kind of partnering with them and influencing them with what they needed. So women would say, oh, yeah, how about this? Like, you guys haven't thought about, children. You haven't thought about this. You haven't thought about that. And then I'd say usually men were like, okay, great. Let's add that in. Let's build together. That's kind of how it went. It could have kept going that way, right? It could have kept going that way because before she was even writing some of these things, there were women influencing law before all of this, right? The Marriage Property Act. Again, there were women saying, hey, we want to go to university. And the men were like, okay, great. Yeah, let's set that up for you. Because men want intelligent women partnering with them in their lives, right? And so it's really interesting that this all kind of blew up during this time of the early 1800s when there was this kind of idea about, men have all this stuff and they've been purposefully keeping it from women. And I think this translates directly to the conversation about how men and women had these two very separate spheres, but both very important and both very needed, and both had their own sets of rights and responsibilities, right? Privileges and responsibilities. So, men took care of the public sphere. Men were focused on safety and protection and provision and building up society, dealing with national issues, dealing with international issues. With that, they had the burden to die for their country if time came to it. They had the burden of dying for their country. They had the burden of falling for all of the responsibility. And so if you think about it, yeah, men were maybe the symbolic head of the family, especially, but that's because they took on all of the back end responsibility for everything. Whereas women were responsible for running their homes, caring for their children, also playing a huge role in local organizations. They were on school boards, they were voting in municipal elections, they were, you know, dealing with so much. They were creating charities, they were influencing men to shift and add to society in ways that were good for women, and men gladly did this, right? Yeah, because the way I see it, it was like, hey guys, we need this. And the men were like, oh, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. That makes sense. Here you go. And that was this really beautiful kind of yin yang that was happening there. And yeah, there were a lot of things that women, weren't allowed to do. And I think that one of the big things here and why this was such a big debate was this idea of the federal vote. And this idea was that, hey, if women get the federal vote, then shouldn't they also have the burden of fighting for their country? Right? Shouldn't they also have the burden of having the specific amount of property, having the specific amount of income required so that you have kind of like skin in the game, literally, financially? You literally have your physical skin in the game. If your country goes to war, you could die. And so the idea was like, hey, let's protect women from this because I don't think they're that interested in these responsibilities anyway. They have other responsibilities, right? And so I think that's what most women figured back at that time was like, hey, we have all these other responsibilities. Like, I think women were privy to the relationship between rights slash privilege and burden slash obligation responsibility. And so I think that Ultimately, women, of course, got the right to vote, but they did not have to go to war. And I think there was some content from Janice that was something about like women when they kept being asked right before they did get suffrage. Ultimately, they were asked, "Well, hey, are you willing to go to war?" And then people like the suffragettes and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they would kind of just shirk that question and they would say, women don't believe in war, right? Women don't support war. We wouldn't have war. And this happened in the early 1900s. How many wars did we have in the 20th century? A whole bunch. So, it's kind of like this delusion almost that I think is really worth talking about. And like I said again, most women were not up for this. They were really keen and clear on their responsibilities. And I think to the women that I love and that I know now, my best friend who is part of the Orthodox Church, she has a big family. She's the most intelligent woman I know. Right. Another woman who I'm actually going to a retreat that she's hosting in Australia. She's just this incredible woman, very strong, very powerful, very wise, love learning from her and connecting with her. And she has she has it really clear, like what her responsibilities are versus what her husband's responsibilities are. And yeah, so this is just one of those things where there's a lot of wonderful women and wonderful men out there that have clear logical thinking, but I think this kind of ideology that took over in that time trickled down and really affected so much of the mainstream that we have now. There's some manipulation behind it, right? So it's like, hey, we want all the rights, but we're not going to take on those new responsibilities. And there's a lot of, like I said, delusion in that. And I think a lot of men are just like, wait, what? And so that trickles down in such a big way because there's the delusion lies in the false thinking that you can have your privilege without your obligation, that you can have your cake and eat it too. And I think this gets right down into some of the sexual politics that are going on in our culture right now, right? After the fallout of the birth control pill, the 60s and 70s. And back to speaking of luxury beliefs, right? Rob's thing around, the upper class wanting to do things differently from the middle and lower classes wanting to set themselves apart. And so, back in the day, they would buy really expensive things, and you could obviously tell who was elite based on like the stuff that they had and the way they carried themselves. But nowadays, you can't, right? You have Zuckerberg wearing a Hanes t-shirt. And so it's all about, hey, marriage is this archaic thing that is really oppressive to women. But I'm going to be married, right? So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she talked about that too, about how like marriage is this terrible burden on women. And meanwhile, she was married, right? She never talked about the value of children and what children actually need, yet she had children. So it's a delusion. And then that trickles down to some of the ways that women are behaving these days, right? A friend of mine was telling me about how he was rewatching like the Road Rules. I remember the Road Rules in like the early 2000s. That was fun. That was like a popular thing on MTV. And there was this competition between the men and women, and some of the stronger women were like, "We're amazing, girl power, girls can do it. We're better than you guys. We'll crush you." And there was this obstacle course, and so they were doing fine, but then at the end, they didn't have enough upper body strength to pull themselves out of this like water swamp thing. And basically, they asked the men for help. They were like, "Can you help me?" And the men did it. Of course, they did it. But it's just like, again, there's this delusion around like, I can do exactly what you can do, but I can't, right? I want to vote, but I'm not going to war. I want to have casual sex, but I don't want to approach men in public. I still want the sexual dynamics we had pre 1960s, but I want the rights of the sexual dynamics that we have today, but I want the responsibilities of the sexual dynamics that we had back in the 1950s. So it's very, very interesting, right? The way that that dynamic has kind of gone on. And so I'm excited to double click a little bit more into this, but it just makes a lot of sense, right? And so it's one of those things you can like connect it to anything. This idea of like rights versus responsibilities, it made me think of the last like 10 years and the amount of obese kind of like supermodels that we saw, right? The overweight supermodels. And so there was this idea that like I want the right to be a supermodel, but I don't want the responsibility of what it means to actually be a supermodel. So then I'm losing the sanctity and the sacredness of what these words even mean and what's behind them, right? Like we all know what a supermodel looks like. Okay. Cindy Crawford, we know what a supermodel looks like. Tyra Banks and all this stuff. And so this idea that like anyone can be a supermodel is a big fat lie and something that like men would never fall in line to, right? So that's why you've never seen an overweight male supermodel. You've never seen that before because men are not delusional in that way. And I think this comes from the masculine grasp on how a privilege does not come alone. A privilege comes with an obligation and a burden. That's just how it works. And so when that trickles down to the sexual dynamics, it's like even some of these early feminists from the 1800s, they were talking about, yeah, some of these luxury beliefs, free love, love is more important than marriage, all this stuff. This trickled down. And she also talked about how like, yeah, like I should have the right to end a sexual relationship and start a new one at any time that I want. But then there was conversation around like, okay, well, then that means that the man providing for you also gets to end his obligation to provide for you, right? And then again, the feminists of the time shirked that question, right? So it's like, oh, I should get to do whatever I want. And you men still have the responsibility to provide for me. You still have the responsibility to go to war. You still have the responsibility to ask me out, even though I have the right now to do whatever I want sexually. So this is a really important pattern that a lot, like myself, women that I'm in circles with, women that I know, women that I love, like we're privy to that, right? And it's an important conversation. And I'll even take it I'm going to wrap this up with a little story. I went to go visit, I went to this workshop in Denver. I've talked about it before, and I had like a half day with a friend who I know there, and he picked me up from where I was staying. We were going to spend the day, and then he was going to take me to the airport. So I had my suitcase, and I imagined, like in my life, that he would come over and take my suitcase and put it in the trunk, and he didn't do that. He watched me take my suitcase. He watched me struggle, put it in the trunk, and I sat in the car and I was like, I'm being real. Like I was like, what is that? That's super strange. I come from an Eastern European background. Like I've never experienced that. I've always had the suitcase taken from me. I've always been the one to ask for help too. And so we talked about it. We talked about it a little bit later, and he was like, "You're a grown ass woman. If you need something, you'll ask for it, right?" And this goes right back to the rights and responsibilities conversation. And it was really cool for me to hear that perspective. And I think a lot of men are coming from that place at this point. It's like, well, you want all these rights. Awesome. So with those, you have a lot of you have to take all the responsibilities as well. And so I think that it's super interesting because then at the end of the day, I said, "Hey, would you take my suitcase and put it in the trunk?" And he was like, "I'd be glad to. I'd love to do that." He was like, "That's great because you're an adult, you're asking for what you need, and you're not assuming, and that's that." And so I think it's really interesting, and it comes into the conversation, really comes into like chivalry came with a lot of responsibility for men and a lot of rights as well. And so there's an important conversation about chivalry. And I'm so curious what you guys think about chivalry in this day and age, right? And how that's, again, I think it's null and void if there's this pushing away of men and saying like, hey, I have my rights, right? Well, then it's like, okay, well, then you have your responsibilities too. And chivalry doesn't really fit in that equation. Chivalry fits into the equation when men have very clear rights and responsibilities, women have very clear rights and responsibilities in other ways. And so, thinking back to, pre the sexual revolution, when women really had a very strong responsibility to modesty and to, they had just a different way of looking at sex. And it was very clear that men were going to be the pursuers. And so chivalry was a part of that. And we all understood that modesty was an important part of the female way of being. And I think that when you give that up, you probably give up the chivalry too. So it's an interesting conversation, but I hope you guys have enjoyed this one. Excited to keep talking about this. Let me know what y'all think in the comments. Hello, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm so happy to be here bringing my wisdom, my truths, all the research I do into pop culture and evolutionary psych and beyond to bring men and women the information that we all need to know to find that ultimate harmony with each other. This is the mission. This is why I'm here. This is what I believe in. So if you found value in what I'm doing here, please help me grow the podcast. And you can do one of two things. Either share the episode with a friend or leave me a review on Spotify or Apple. This will help me so much. Until next time.